Good afternoon to the Columbia community joining us today. My name is Merritt Jano. I'm Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. And we're very honored to host Bill Gates today for this discussion with our Columbia community on his very new book, indeed just out, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, the solutions we have and the breakthroughs we need. From his unique point of dedication to poverty alleviation and exposure to energy poverty, this book offers a really valuable roadmap for how to tackle the threat of climate change. Bill Gates outlines the big transformative actions that need to be taken in support of innovation by governments, firms, markets, and society to get to zero. And importantly, he thinks the world can do it. This book could not be more timely or important. And across this great university, whether in the sciences, engineering, social sciences, public policy, or business, Columbia University is deeply committed to educating tomorrow's leaders and conducting research on climate science, technology, and working on this global challenge. And here at SIPA, climate, energy, and sustainability are core focus for our school. Our faculty research, our PhD program in sustainable development, our master's programs, and our academic centers, including our Center on Global Energy Policy, which connects the university's research to the policies and policy tools needed to deliver climate solutions. Columbia University is bringing together all of the capabilities that we have in expanded and innovative ways with the launch of a new climate school, the first of its kind in the nation, and the first new school at Columbia in over 30 years. We start this afternoon with a very brief introductory video before turning the conversation over to Jason Bordoff to moderate. Jason is a member of the SIPA faculty with senior policy experience and the founding director of our extraordinary Center on Global Energy Policy. Bill, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for making time to join us at Columbia University today. Thank you very much.
In a typical year, the world emits over 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases. And as we keep doing that, the consequences for human life will be catastrophic. When I first fell in love with computers as a teenager, they were enormous, expensive, and only the government and big companies could afford them. But my friends and I became obsessed with a wild idea. What could we do if there was a computer on every desk? And now the wild idea is quite tame. Billions of people not only have computers on their desks, but even in their pockets. Now the world needs another breakthrough. In fact, it needs many breakthroughs. We need to get from 51 billion tons to zero while still meeting the planet's basic needs. That means we need to transform the way we do almost everything. Our commitment to developing these innovations will mean the difference between a future where everyone can live a healthy, productive life and one where we're constantly dealing with the human and financial crises at a historic scale. Entrepreneurs and investors have to build new businesses and change existing businesses to get these solutions deployed. Government leaders have to enact new policies that drive the market for clean energy. And advocates have to keep their voices loud to hold all of us accountable for rapid progress. Avoiding a climate disaster will be one of the greatest challenges humans have ever taken on, greater than landing on the moon, greater than eradicating smallpox, even greater than putting a computer on every desk. My basic optimism about climate change comes from my belief in innovation. It's our power to invent that makes me hopeful.
Bill, thank you so much for joining the faculty, the students, the staff of Columbia University this afternoon to discuss your wonderful new book. I have it right here, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. Occasionally the cliche, he needs no introduction, is actually true. I think that's the case today. So I will save that since we're short on time and simply say thank you, Bill, for writing this book. It's an exceptionally clear, persuasive, and evidence-based explanation of the urgency of the climate crisis, what it means to take seriously the magnitude of a goal like net zero, and what a roadmap for policymakers should look like to put us on that trajectory. It's a tremendous contribution, and I highly recommend it to everyone watching if you haven't read it yet. So let me begin, if I could, just by asking you how you came to write it. You're, of course, known for founding Microsoft and with your wife for philanthropy focused on global health and poverty, pandemics, of course. Why a book on climate change now?
Yeah, so in the year 2000, I made a significant gift to create the Gates Foundation. And that got me spending quite a bit of time in Africa, focused on learning about malaria and diarrhea and pneumonia, but also seeing how the economies there were held back by not having electricity. We couldn't even keep our vaccines in refrigerators because of no electricity. And I was hearing from the poorest there, overwhelmingly, those are farmers, about how their crop productivity was going down and they were facing more floods, more droughts. And so I set about learning about climate and what that would mean for the aspirations that Africa has. And I was lucky enough to have a few professors who would bring in about 6 times a year experts on aspects like the modeling or carbon capture or all sorts of elements that go into climate. And after 5 years of that, I did 2 things. One was I funded a company to do low-cost nuclear fission reactors, seeing that as a potential part of the climate solution and electricity for Africa. And I gave a TED Talk. I have 2 TED Talks that are somewhat well known. By far the best known is one I actually did in 2015 about the pandemic, but this one about climate focused on the innovation and this idea that unless you get services with 0 emissions, you really can't get all the way down to 0. You can get reductions, but multiplying by 0 is this key thing. The next big milestone was the Paris climate talks, where almost a year before that, I was talking to Modi and Hollande and Obama and saying that without R&D, we just can't solve these problems, and encouraging countries to double their energy and climate related R&D. And we got about 19 countries, all the big ones, to attend. That was called Mission Innovation. And I made a commitment to do a venture group focused entirely on climate with a super strong scientific staff. And that became Breakthrough Energy Ventures, that's already finished its first $1 billion fund and just raised the second. And then I was looking at the field and saying, wow, it's great that young people are caring more and more, and even the pandemic, to my surprise, hasn't diminished that. But in a way, you have this zealous caring of a generation, and you've got this great goal, but you don't really have a plan. And so to indicate some key elements of how you accelerate innovation and how that fits into an overall plan, I decided that this would be a good time to put out the book.
There are a couple of important numbers in your book, and in your description just now, you mentioned one of them, which is 0, not well below 2 degrees or 80% reduction by 2050, which was the goal when I served in the Obama administration, but 0, or more precisely, net 0. Just help people understand why that is so important.
Yeah, so the sad fact is that as you put CO2 in the atmosphere, it has a thousands of years residence time. And so you basically have the sum of all the emissions of CO2 since the industrial age as something that's forcing up the temperature. And there's this multiplier factor of how much the direct CO2 increase through other things, including higher temperature means more water in the atmosphere as well. There's some uncertainty about that factor, but there's a multiplication factor. Then once you get that temperature number, then you have to map that into weather. What does that mean for drying out the centers of continents and heating up the ocean, melting the ice, destroying natural ecosystems through things like ocean acidification? And so there too, there's a pretty good understanding, but with some uncertainty. And so as long as you're driving more CO2 in, therefore temperature up, therefore more of these bad things, particularly for the poorest in the world, it's really disastrous. Farming anywhere near the equator by the end of the century, if we don't intervene in a big way, will become impossible, and hundreds of millions of people will migrate north in a way that is worse than anything seen in human history. And so zero's, it is the necessary goal. Now, when you look at how emissions have gone up over the years, and even with the pandemic, it's a less than 10% reduction. That does seem very daunting. 2050 is a goal because it's the soonest that we could get to zero, not because it's all hunky-dory. In fact, the negative effects of climate, we need to help countries with adaptation while we do this reduction in emissions, which is called mitigation. And so I put one chapter in the book about better seeds, helping these farmers with that adaptation piece while we drive towards 2050 zero.
And the other number you have in the book is 51 billion, which helps to remind people, even 2050 net zero, how staggeringly difficult that is. Just help people understand why 51 billion is an important number.
Yeah, so that's mapping. You hear lots of numbers, and in the climate space, my goal is that when people read articles, somebody will say, hey, that's like 10,000 cars or 40,000 households. If we can get people to write in the articles the tons reduced, then everybody can simply do it as a percentage of 51 billion. And see, are you talking about some rounding error thing, which sadly most of the time it's unimportant. And in fact, some of it's not even the kind of stuff that takes you towards zero, like switching to natural gas or reducing the units used in a rich country, which, yeah, that takes you a certain distance, but it doesn't get you anywhere near zero. So that, the math of 51 billion, okay, and then also, where are those 51 billion coming from? Sadly,
and that's, just to be clear for people watching, that's current tons of greenhouse gas emissions each
exactly.
year.
We convert the non-CO2 emissions, like the methane, which is the second biggest, into CO2 equivalents, and that's a little bit complicated, but basically 51 billion tons is emitted out into the atmosphere in 2019, and except for a tiny wiggle for economic recessions and now the pandemic, we've never driven that number down. It just goes up, and of course, countries that are developing and just building infrastructure, if you look at the forecast without intervention, it'll be these middle income countries like China at the high end and India at the low end, where most of those emissions are coming from. The US today is a little under 15% of global emissions.
And when you think about not just stopping the rise, but actually bringing that number down sharply, you have a lot of great charts in the book. I think there may be a reason. The very first one is the relationship between income growth and energy use around the world. I think there's a tendency to see lots of exciting headlines about the growth rates of renewables, the cost declines of renewables, and think a clean energy transition is well underway. But I read you to be saying in the book, tell me if it's right, two things can both be true. We can grow clean energy very rapidly, and emissions can still rise. And is that right? And if so, what does that tell us about taking net zero seriously?
Yeah, there's a lot of articles that say, solar grew by 200% or 300%, but it's off of a tiny base. And so even in the US, where assuming we get transmission up very, very high, so that we can use a lot of renewables, we are still in very small numbers. Hydropower is still bigger than all the renewables put together. And, building out renewables, just the physical effort, the land permitting, the fact that it's coming intermittently from different locations than when you need the power. It's, to get to a zero emission grid, which has been stated as a goal by 2035, would be very, very difficult. We have a open source model now that the Breakthrough Energy my team has put together so that people can plug in for that 2035 grid. What are they assuming about storage, nuclear, transmission, increase in demand, and then you plug in these super tough weather events that are basically cold fronts in the Midwest or high heat wave conditions where your power sources go down and your power demand goes up, and yet you don't want to freeze people to death or let people overheat without their air conditioning. And we can see, what is realistic. And, you'll just see how daunting it is that the build rate is over 3 times greater than the amount we've ever done. And that you're really going to have to perform incredible work on transmission and either some type of energy storage that's miraculously better, or the only scalable non-weather dependent source of green energy, which is proven, which is nuclear fission, of course, with all of the attendant challenges that mean we need a new generation of those reactors for both economic and safety reasons. So, now we're getting into the real plan stage of this thing. 15 years, if you go out to permit transmission, you may or may not have it built in 15 years. It's not as easy now to think of this as way out in the future. Utility executives have to look at that and go, wow, how are we going to take the idealism that's causing this youthful push and really not, fail to deliver and make, people cynical about whether we really were taking this seriously.
Yeah, I want to ask you again what it means to take it seriously. I hear you saying we need to scale, commercialize, deploy the low carbon technologies we have today, but we also need a lot more to get to net zero. And there are a lot of ideas for what to do, from more bike lanes to fusion reactors and a million other things. But you have a framework I think is really useful in the book to prioritize where to focus, whether it's philanthropy, investment, policy. Where are the tons? And where are what you call the green premiums? So can you talk about each of those and what it tells you about where we should be focused in policy or finance, or maybe building a new climate school at a place like Columbia?
Yeah, so let's start with the sources of greenhouse gases, and I've got a slide for that. This is where that 51 billion tons are coming from. And if we only had to do 50% reduction, we could take the hard parts, what we see up here, and just say, okay, we don't need to work on that one. Let's work on the easy ones. Sadly, because we're going for the 100% to stop the temperature rise, none of the things up here are optional. So I'm showing 5 big categories. The 2 that people probably are most aware of are electricity generation with coal and natural gas emissions, and then passenger cars. Between the 2 of those, you're a bit less than a third of overall emissions. And so the awareness of the other 2/3, which sadly are the hardest 2/3, is fairly low. You have agriculture, which is cows with methane and manure and making fertilizer. You've got the other parts of transportation, planes and long distance trucking. You've got buildings, heating and cooling. And then actually the biggest sector that I think, unless somebody's a student of Smill's books, which don't sell in large quantities, the awareness of the miracle of the industrial economy, how we make cement very cheap and steel very cheap and all the physical goods, most people are taking that for granted, and yet at 31%, it's the biggest area. So for each of these areas of emission, we can compare the green approach, that is making it with no emissions, to the current approach and compare those prices. And the increase to be green is what I call the green premium. And what you'll see is that electricity and passenger cars have the lowest green premium. Cement, aviation fuel, they have some of the highest green premiums. And I would propose that of all the metrics, and there's lots, and we need many, but the gold standard metric is the scale of the green premium, because when India in 2050 is trying to decide, do I do it the green way or not, they will be saying to the US, amongst others, hey, how big is that green premium? How many fewer houses or air conditioners are asking us to provide when we are not responsible for these emissions? And if those green premiums for India are trillions of dollars, it won't get subsidized and it won't get paid for by India. They'll continue to emit. And so I predict about a 95% reduction in the aggregate green premium is where that discussion with India would go well, that a little bit of subsidization, a little bit of India stretching on its own would cause them to go green, which if they don't, their share of global emissions will be very, very high.
So we have a lot of work to do on some of the technologies and green premiums. I want to ask you about policy. As someone who runs a policy center, you write, I'll try not to take offense, you write, quote, policy is a vague, dull sounding word. And you write, quote, the bottom line is that our current energy policies will have only a negligible impact on future emissions. So we got a lot of energy policies on the book. You're saying, I think what you're saying is they're not going to add up to much. I still have a lot of work to do. So the Biden administration just announced a slew of actions and executive orders. How much do all of those do to get on the right track? And what else do we need to do from a policy standpoint?
Yeah, the current policies, many of them were born from a different perspective, like a local pollution perspective. And of course, the more we learned about coal and how the particulate was affecting health or what the acidification was doing, the more we realized we needed to really increase our standards on those coal plants. And then as natural gas became cheaper, we got a shift that has been helpful in reducing CO2 emissions, although not down to zero. Getting better miles per gallon is a great thing. A lot of that was born out of the energy security efforts, which are fantastic, but not directly aimed at greenhouse gas reductions. And so now we need policies that go after that. We have some, like the renewable portfolio standards at the state level, that have been good because they've given the utility commission their permission to allow the utilities to spend a little bit more money in pursuit of reduced emissions. And so there are some good models for policy. My Breakthrough Energy group works with Columbia because thinking this through is very complex. How do you have supply of innovation, which is R&D dollars, and then you have risk money like venture capital. But that alone, if you just create the innovation, unless there's a demand for it, it's not going to work. Like when Breakthrough Energy Ventures funds a company that can make steel with a much lower green premium, it's still a non-zero green premium. And this steel is no better. In fact, because it's made slightly differently, there's a lot of concern, does it last as long? And the building codes are fairly hardwired to the current recipe. And so I claim that we need as much innovation in the policy piece here as we do even down at the basic science level, to create buying signals to recreate what happened, say, with solar panels, where Japan and Germany paid huge green premiums. Then places like the US came in with the tax credits. And now, modular reliability, those things are mainstream and the numbers will will go up as long as we put them into a system with storage and nuclear and transmission that gives you that reliability. Over 80% of the energy sources will be the various renewables, hopefully including offshore wind to go with land-based solar and land-based wind. But the policy space, particularly now when you have the Biden administration declaring this a priority, taking the Build Back Better focus and saying, okay, a lot of that will be climate related. Well, how do you structure the tax credit or the government procurement policy, or things like California zero emission vehicles, which worked well, or low carbon fuel standards? There's a lot that needs to be done, and then you have the pragmatic consideration of, okay, what can get passed? We don't just want the ideal policy. We want to take every one of the next 30 years and take full advantage of them, since we need that to hit the goal.
Yeah. We're going to turn to students in just a second, but you mentioned breakthrough energy ventures in your answer there, and I just wanted to ask you to quickly, you've not only written a book, you've also established Breakthrough Energy. Can you just tell people what the specific programs are that are part of Breakthrough Energy and how they interact with and support the efforts you just described?
Yeah, great. I have a slide that'll help show this a bit. So, when you want to do these innovations, you start with just the basic R&D, then the translational R&D. There'll be some philanthropy there, but that's mostly the government, like it does in healthcare in such a strong way. And a lot of that's in the Department of Energy budget. And, I'm hoping that goes up dramatically. Then two efforts that are under the Breakthrough Energy umbrella I've done. One is funding people who have ideas, but not fundable as a company, just giving them capital, whether they're in academia or a big company that they want to pull their thoughts together. We just started that, but we have incredible applications. Then we have the venture funding, which has been super successful with over 40 companies and now a second fund to fund over 40 more. So that's supply side of innovation, working across all the areas of emission. In the first fund, we got more in storage and food than we expected. That was wonderful. In the second fund, we'll look super hard for things like direct air capture, green hydrogen, because there were less of those, and yet those are super important. And then we have the idea of buying products that still have a high green premium to get the volume up, to get on the learning curve, to get the price down. We call that catalyst. That one we're just putting together. We're talking to corporations about that. We'll get philanthropic capital and we'll buy, some green hydrogen just in the next year, or green aviation fuel. And then finally, policy. Policy really touches on everything here as you're trying to get these green premiums to go way down.
Yeah, good to hear you say policy touches on everything, given how much of our time we spend on it every day here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. So I want to turn to student. We have several students joining us now with questions. We're going to open our discussion for questions from students and the rest of the audience. For all our viewers, you can submit a question at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if you are a student, please let us know your school and your program for Bill when you submit your question. We're going to start by having Maria Castillo join us on camera. She's a senior at the Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science, studying Earth and Environmental Engineering. Maria, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gates. It's a pleasure to have you join us today. My question is, what governmental developments in the conversation and debates on putting a cost on carbon do you find the most promising or exciting?
Yeah, so it's great that we can look at each of the governments and see what they're doing best. The UK's an interesting case because, of course, coal started there, and they led the Industrial Revolution, and yet they've done more to get rid of coal generation than any other country. They're also engaged in getting the green premium on offshore wind down, which will not only be important for the UK, it's almost a necessary part of the US having this renewable grid that off the East Coast in a large way that we incur that the offshore wind. There's great work going on in bringing down the price of solar. China's been very big on that. They're ahead on electric buses, which are another significant source of emissions, and almost ready for prime time. Getting rid of natural gas heating of homes where you move to electric heat pumps. Some of the states have had incentive programs around that. California, I would say, the zero emission vehicle, low cost fuel standards, it's kind of wild to solve climate at the state level, but it's fantastic that particularly for the last 4 years where there wasn't the federal push, that both of those policies made a huge difference. Increasing R&D, the US under the Obama administration got the numbers up a bit. For the last 4 years, it's just been a fight to make sure it didn't get cut. But we're hopeful now we'll go back into that increase. And my dream is that we get it all the way up to the level we invest in health research, which at over 35 billion a year is a huge investment, but it's had big payback. After all, the US innovates on behalf of the world, we also want to create companies and jobs and exports like we have in medicine and digital things. And that the R&D budgets were absolutely critical for those things. So the great thing about these climate talks is you can share best practices, and you can talk about who sees a possibility on cement, who's seen that we can make green hydrogen that would help with lots of industrial things, including steel, but nobody's got this one solved. Even Norway, who's got the highest carbon tax, it's not, they're not anywhere near zero emissions.
We have some questions on video, some just coming in the chat. So for a question from the audience from Flavia Maia from Brazil, she's an Obama scholar at Columbia. She asks, in a recent interview to BBC, you said it will be impossible to avoid a disaster, particularly for those who live near the equator, without governments around the world getting behind the effort. Can you comment more on this? And how can I, as a public leader in a climate hotspot on the equator line, raise awareness and funding to address the extreme vulnerability of my community to climate change?
Yeah, so Brazil is one of the tougher ones, not as bad as Africa or India. But if, for example, the Amazon is deforested enough and it switches to be a savanna, the cooling effect of the Amazon rainforest would go away, and Brazil would look a lot like other equatorial countries. Right now, that cooling effect is pretty profound and allows for agricultural productivities in areas like soy that are really good, but that profit opportunity is also driving some of that deforestation. So Brazil is super important to prove, for them that the deforestation is a big part of it. Without that agricultural productivity, that's not just bad for Brazil, it's really bad for the world at large. Then you're going to tear down more forests in other parts of the world as the price of the food is going up. As the temperature goes up, you get more days where humans can't work outside. If the humidity is high enough and the absolute temperature is high enough, then our sweat-based cooling system, which is the best of any mammal, that's our specialization, is being able to cover long distances on the plains for group hunting. It stops working. And so for things like farming or construction, you actually see productivity go down as the temperature goes up. But then you hit a point where you just can't work outdoors at all, and with the biggest impact on agriculture. Likewise, our seeds right now can't deal with drought or flood very well. They can't deal with temperature very well. So that's a grossly underinvested area, is the so-called CG system that does that seed research. And that helps both reduce emissions because you destroy less land, and it's a huge adaptation help because higher productivity means even if your crops are failing, say 1 year out of 5, your savings, your buffer stock can take care of you.
Just a quick follow-up, and then I'll go back to the students, because you talked about the Amazon, obviously in Brazil, and a lot of focus on planting trees, on avoiding deforestation. You seem a little skeptical in the book that there's a lot of focus on trying to buy carbon offsets now, how those forestry projects work. And that's a big piece of emissions, land use, agriculture, forestry. But am I right to read a little bit of skepticism about how much trees can be part of the solution here?
Well, the key tree thing is to not knock down the tropical forests that we have. They are incredibly important as a store of carbon and the way they cool those areas and allow them to work for agriculture. So in terms of planting new trees, the nature is actually pretty good at planting trees. If you've got great soil, great water, there aren't gigantic areas. There was the one article that just didn't really look at the criteria properly, and so it overstated by a factor of 10 where you could grow new trees. Also, trees, particularly the fast-growing kind, have a limited lifetime, and so if you're going to think of those as an offset, you've got a fund for thousands of years that if it gets diseased, if there's a fire, if you're saying it's a place nature doesn't know how to plant trees, then you've got to be there to match the greenhouse gas reduction that you're claiming credit for. So it's there, but it's a percentage of the 51 billion. I claim that by the time we raise the quality of our understanding, it will be a modest percentage, not zero, but nowhere near the trillion trees, hey, this is all you need to do type thinking that's got the offset world in a little bit of an immature state.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Our next video question comes from Robert Winton, a Columbia engineering senior studying earth and environmental engineering. Robert, please. Okay,
Hello.
Robert, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My question is, so far, a lot of early clean energy and climate innovations have been affordable to wealthy individuals for a long time first. For example, early adopters of rooftop solar or electric vehicles. Given that low-income communities, both in the US and globally, will face the worst and most acute impacts of climate change, how can the innovations that you believe need investing in deliver immediate benefits to such communities? Are there successful examples we can learn from that have avoided needing years to lower green premiums?
Yeah, so the old process, the dirty non-green process for these things is incredibly optimized. The way we make fertilizer, for example, is close to the energy theoretical minimum, taking natural gas, which means you've got zero CO2 emissions. So it's very hard for a new process to come in with this constraint and hit anywhere near that super low price. Your point about consumers is absolutely right. Electric cars, even though the tax credit has driven demand, which from a climate point of view is a good thing, it's kind of a regressive tax. That is, it's mostly people with above average income that get the benefit of that tax. So the question of, should it phase out over the time? Should it have an income test that goes with it? Those are very legitimate questions. As part of my climate work, I realized there's a whole environmental justice movement in the United States, and started to understand some of their concerns, where historically a lot of the more polluting activities that affected both air and water were near the low-income communities, where you had more people of color. And so those are really legitimate concerns that the Biden administration has taken on. I would say if you think globally, the great injustice is how little we put into high impact adaptation efforts. For many years, there was this discussion that $100 billion per year would show up for something, and people have tried to just map the various private sector flows and come up with that number. In fact, a lot of the things are need grant funding, like this seed work on behalf of the poorest. Some products will get to very low green premiums, and the artificial meat products are fairly low green premium right now, and they claim to have a path over the next decade that they won't have to charge extra at all. Likewise, electric cars, although that's probably 10 to 15 years if you include the getting the charge points out and the range type elements. And so if we're not careful, a lot of these climate policies don't speak to inequity. And so how do you combine those two things? That's partly one of these policy constraints, particularly for communities that have gotten jobs from hydrocarbon related activities. We don't want climate to be one party is for it, one party's against it, because in these next 30 years, you're going to have both parties in charge. And when you're saying to a steel plant person, hey, put billions into your new approach, they've got to feel like the policies that encourage the green approach are going to be there for that gigantic capital investment. And so the uncertainty that comes with these issues is a real challenge.
Yeah, it's a really good point about communities in transition and dislocated communities, and really having good policy solutions for them. The next question from the audience is from David Vakari. He says, I am an MA student at Columbia. I'm also Italian, and I point this out because tragically, in his view, Italians voted to remove nuclear as a form of energy production with multiple referendums, the last one in 2011. He writes, I admire you, Mr. Gates, for everything, and including your position on nuclear energy. How do you think we should act when scientific positions are clear, but the popular opinion is so against them? How could we gather enough popular support in a short time for the climate threat that faces us? Maybe you could comment on both your view on nuclear and what the solutions around advanced nuclear technology might look like, and also his point about how do we get popular opinion to be based in science?
Yeah, so the nuclear industry, sadly, is shrinking primarily because of the costs of building these reactors. As we went from the first generation to the second to the third generation, we appropriately added all sorts of safety equipment, but we got very, very complex and fairly large reactors that, particularly if you're competing with natural gas prices in the United States, you're not even close to being competitive. I mean, some of these are almost 4 times more expensive than you'd have to be to compete with natural gas. And so, yes, because nuclear is green, we should help it, but we need a new design. We need a new design for economic reasons, safety reasons, waste proliferation. And so this thing where we just kind of added on top of the original 1950s shipping port work, which was based on water cooling, you end up with a lot of high pressure in the reactor, a lot of pumps, and a need for operators to push the right buttons at the right time. Instead, what we want is something that is inherently safe. That is the heat pool, and in the case of TerraPower, that's a molten sodium heat pool, can retain even the after heat, which was the problem with second generation Fukushima. Also, weirdly, was the problem that they were trying to test against when they made the mistakes they did at Chernobyl, both operating and design problems there. So nuclear's actual safety record is very good. It's very hard for people to perceive that when they think about nuclear weapons and the few big incidences, of which only Chernobyl was, super bad. And so I hope people will have an open mind that, because it will be key to the reliability of the network, which we've seen in Texas last week, that's not to be taken for granted. Their problem didn't happen to be renewables shutting down, and some people misled the public on that. But it does raise this legitimate issue of reliability, which if you had 80% renewable and 20% nuclear with a little bit of storage and lots of transmission, you can make it all work. And so it's both, there's an engineering challenge to get the fourth generation to be shown to be super economic. And then as you suggest, there's this public perception of, okay, how safe is this thing? And somehow people don't pay attention to what coal or natural gas do in terms of safety nearly as much. You know, we need experts to be trusted because climate, we're never going to educate everyone on climate. The younger generation, we should have courses, the sort of basic ideas, including the negative effects, should be well understood. But Europe right now, actually the US public is more open-minded on nuclear than most of Europe. So that's hard work to do once we get this new generation.
Time is short and I want to get to as many student questions as we can. So our next video question comes from Sarah Braverman, a second-year MPA student with a concentration in environmental science and policy. Sarah, please.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today, Mr. Gates. My question has two parts. First, what role does wealth distribution play in combating climate change? And second, how can we get the world's wealthiest individuals and businesses to financially contribute to the clean energy transition and climate mitigation strategies?
Yeah, so, the tax policies of different countries, vary a lot. There's no doubt in the case of the US, which is the one I know the best, that we could have more progressive taxation. That is, people like myself could pay significantly more in taxes. That's good news because if you look at the, particularly post-pandemic, but even before it, the things we expect the government to do in terms of healthcare, where the costs keep going up, and pensions, and now imperatives like climate that will require investment in many different forms, not just R&D and procurement, paying green premiums, but also helping the communities that might otherwise have negative effects. Government needs more revenue in order to do those things. You can certainly go too far and disincentivize private sector activity, but the US is pretty far away from that threshold. And so, we can have a debate there. Other countries I don't know as well, but a lot of them are, very similar to the US. Whatever the rich people have left over, it would be good if they commit some of that to the high risk climate activities. And I have to say, we're seeing a lot more of that. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, I have 20 people who I called up to put money into breakthrough energy ventures, and I got, like 20 yeses out of 22 calls. And so there is a willingness and a growing awareness this is important. The companies in America that are doing well are stepping up to be good citizens on this. The standards that we hold them to need to get more rigorous, like, okay, are they buying offsets? That's good. It's better to buy even low quality offsets than not to buy them, but can we over time raise the bar on the impact of the renewable energy credits or those offset areas? So a lot that can be done, and the companies, as I've talked to them, they're interested in engaging, partly because their employees care a lot about it, seems to be very strong.
We have a question from the audience from Spencer Bruce. He's a senior studying computer science and sociology in the engineering school. He writes over, this is a depressing question, I think, but hopefully you'll give me some optimism. He writes, over 5 years ago, you warned about the threat of an antibiotic, antiviral resistant pathogen that would cause a pandemic. And seeing where we are now, with your fears unfortunately being realized, how do you hope your warnings about climate change will be different than your warnings about a pandemic?
No, it's a super good question because the scale of investment required to be ready for a pandemic is much smaller than for climate. There were things like being able to diagnose at scale using the commercial PCR machines that the US just messed up. Some countries did not. I'm sure we'll make those investments for the next time around. In general, government has to protect you, so for like earthquakes, they have building codes, or for, war, they have not only the defense budget, but they do war games. In the case of pandemic, they let the citizens down, despite, myself and some others who were speaking about that. Climate may be the hardest challenge of all to get government to step up because of this global nature, and that the real pain, the severe pain, where Miami Beach disappears, that's out towards the end of the century. And yet we're saying that we need to make investments now to preserve these natural ecosystems and to, help all the countries of the world. And so unless the young generation is kind of amazing in viewing this as a moral cause that they believe in beyond their own individual success, unless that's massive, the prioritization and effort won't get done. I am seeing that I think that'll happen. I wasn't part of creating that, but it's a necessary element for something that's this difficult to get the resources that it needs.
And just very quickly, the two answers you just gave, the high net worth individuals and the governments, and how much Jeff Bezos and others are putting into this. But as you said, you need so much more spending for this than a pandemic. How big a disconnect is there? I mean, if this is an existential challenge, tons stay up there for thousands of years. How much more do we need to be doing, governments or philanthropists or others?
Well, like on the R&D side, I want to get up towards the health R&D budget, which is $35 billion a year, versus depending on how you define it, we're currently spending about $6 to $12 billion out of the federal level. And so in a way, that's a lot of money, but compared to trillions of dollars of damage, the pandemic really has hurt the economy, but climate change would be much bigger. And there isn't this one tool like the vaccine that you can invent after the problem hits you, and then boom, you, although with lots of damage, you can get back to normal. With climate, once the coral reefs die off, it's not like you reduce CO2 emissions and then they just magically come back. That's in evolutionary timescales, millions of years before you get any of that kind of restoration. So this one is bigger, harder, more pervasive. This will be the biggest thing humanity's ever done. And historians of energy and industry, remind us that moving at this kind of speed, there is no historical precedent for the amount of change that we would need each of the next 30 years.
Yeah. Our next video question comes from Emily Becker, an MPA student with a concentration in environmental science and policy. Emily, please.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. My question is more focused on current events. Over the last week or so, we've seen a considerable amount of misinformation about power outages in Texas, with many falsely attributing system outages to the state's wind turbines failing. How do we combat the use of disasters like this one as anti-renewable cases?
Yeah, so all these sources of energy can be weatherized. It costs more money. Literally, there was a nuclear reactor that just the reservoir level sensor froze up, and so it tripped that one plant to go offline, and it came back up a few days later. The biggest thing was that the natural gas plants had not been weatherized. And of course, we know that natural gas plants can run in Alaska and North Dakota. They spent extra money. And in the Texas case, they hadn't incented that type of reliability. It was more of a short-term bid market. And then, of course, Texas is special in that it's chosen to have even less transmission connections with the rest of the country than the East Coast grid and the West Coast grid. They have their own ERCOT, Energy Reliability Council of Texas, that does not interconnect to any meaningful degree to other states. And that would have solved this problem for them, because other states had some capacity that could have been made available. So it's a very interesting thing that people chose to blame it on renewables, but that actually the issue of reliability is a legitimate issue. Eventually, when you try to get above 80% renewables, it is very, very hard to maintain reliability. You either need that storage miracle or nuclear and a massive transmission capabilities so that all works. I do think that some Republicans are coming around on climate where they'll accept that it's a problem, accept there's a goal, and then fine, disagree about let's use the private sector more and the government less. We need that debate. We need both parties, trying to optimize the cost of achieving this goal. And I actually, in policy, although there's lots to be done, this issue of moving it to be, okay, we all agree we need to defend the country, and now we can still debate the defense budget, or that health R&D is important. The bipartisan nature of the funding of the NIH really has been phenomenal. Even in these last 4 years where the executive branch tried to cut it, it continued to get very strong bipartisan support.
Our last question, Bill, comes from Kaylin Spiller, a senior in Columbia College, and she says an alumna of your high school, Lakeside High School. What can each of us individually do to change the course of climate change? And your book speaks to it and talks about the importance of individual action, but also the limits for something that is a systemic issue. Just be great to hear you close with that.
Yeah, I'd say, there's kind of 4 areas to think about. One is that as you educate yourself, you can share that with people, why you care, why you're putting time into it. If you can each educate one Republican, one Democrat, then it's like a chain letter that the numbers would be fantastic. You can get involved politically because, policy matters so much. You're a consumer. So if an electric car is within reach, if as you go into a burger chain, you see Impossible or Beyond as an option, the more you pick that, the more they get volume and they invest in R&D to get their price down and their quality up. And there'll be lots of goods that are labeled in terms of the emissions impact. And so favoring those that have that lower emissions impact will try to drive that scale up reduction of the green premium. Finally, you're eventually going into the labor market, and whatever company you work for, you can raise their bar on, if you want to be an employee there, you want a company that's in its own activities, applying its expertise and its purchasing power to bring down those emissions. And now we're getting lots of good tracking of those things. The goal then is to have people feel that pressure so that they're participating in this monumental task.
Bill, thanks for your time today, for being with all of us at Columbia. Thank you for writing this book, really, as I said, valuable contribution to improving people's understanding about the urgency of climate change and what the solutions are. And of course, thank you for your generous philanthropy, not only to tackle climate change, but so many other critical needs, from pandemics to global health and poverty and much more. It was an honor to have you with us today. Thank you to all of my Columbia colleagues for joining us, and thanks especially to our amazing students for your thoughtful and insightful questions. It's sometimes easy to be pessimistic about this problem. They're so immense, but our students really do inspire us every day through their passion and their commitment to building a more sustainable energy future. So thank you, Bill, so much for your time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Have a good day. Goodbye.